My name is Arun Jagtiani, and I'm a proud St. Martin. In a few short weeks, our country is going to be heading to the polls to elect 15 new members to Parliament, and I think the entire voting population could benefit from knowing a little bit more about who these candidates are. Over the next few days, I'm going to interview a few new faces and a few political veterans. So join me, St. Martin, and let's talk politics. Welcome to a special edition of Talking Politics with Arun Jagtiani. These are the bonus interviews for Season 2, and I'm joined today by the former Minister of VSA, none other than Mr. Emil Lee. Emil, how are you doing today?
Great, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming through our studios and being a part of our Season 2 on the bonus edition. I want to cut straight into the chase. Yeah, let's get straight into it. We had a nice warm-up conversation off camera. You've quickly become a household name on the St. Martin political scene. And you made a lot of headlines in your last term as Minister of VSA. Most notably, you were voted, there was a vote of no confidence casted against you. Yes. And surprisingly, it was initiated from within your own party. Yes. I'd love to get your side of the story and your perception on what happened there.
You know, I think you can't really see it as anything other than a betrayal. The way I see it, we went into government with good intentions, and actually the coalition, so meaning the members of the parliament that support the government, yes, and the incoming ministers, we all created a document where we laid out what was the plan going ahead for that governing period, which should have been by all rights 4 years. Everything that we were doing and everything that I was doing as minister was in accordance with that governing program, including the construction of a new hospital, general health insurance, everything that we agreed upon. And in addition to that, all of the things that were related to the recovery post-Irma, all again, included in the documents. So for me, I was doing my job. The new hospital's going to come online. Nothing's changed. The general health insurance is ready to go to Parliament for discussion. Okay. And so for me, for everything that I tried to do to talk to him and try and come to an understanding, and actually all of the other coalition members didn't support the motion. As a matter of fact, they said, but Emil's doing a good job. We don't understand your problem. He didn't even want to talk about it. But instead, what did he do? He went to opposition, who clearly have issues with me, because I stand for integrity and honesty, and they had some issues from the past. And so they worked together with him to create chaos within government. That's what very often opposition likes to do. And so I was very disappointed, obviously.
And now here we find ourselves again, just a little bit over a year ago from our last election. In your opinion, what do we need to do to stop tripping over this? Because if it's not you, it's somebody else. Or there seems to always be, a reason or fabricated reason in some cases to throw down the government. How can we fix this problem?
Well, I think it's important then that you look at root causes. What is the real reason why government changes? And in my opinion, it stems from a sort of, let's call it a kind of a corruption, right? You have members of parliament who want to appoint ministers, some within the coalition. And unfortunately, what happens is it's almost always a coalition, and then there's a negotiation about the split of the ministries, which is why very often you hear people refer to my minister.
And I've always felt offended by that statement because it should be the people's minister, right?
And I think you should be appointing people that you feel are capable of doing the job. And I have to give credit. I think my leader, Sarah Westcott Williams, has always empowered me and guided me, but never felt like she was somehow manipulating or trying to control me. Okay. But some of the others, I find that what the tendency is to put people in that can be manipulated, that can be controlled. And then when the ministers go in and then they see the realities of how things really operate, and they're not willing to do certain things, they're not willing to bend some rules, then you start to get this friction between, yeah, but I put you there, you need to do what I tell you to do, and then you start with this whole friction between government and then the coalition, and then inevitably somebody says, well, I'm not getting what I want, so I'm going to take my marbles and go play with somebody else. This is really a childish behavior to jump ship.
I think, many within the community have kind of made the observation. I've heard the comment from many business people and others within society that say, a lot of the ministers are appointed as puppets. Yes. Exactly like you said, my minister.
I don't want to denigrate them. Some of the ministers are very nice people, good people, but they feel like they're sort of, and I feel that the last governing term was one of the worst in terms of the interference from coalition. I mean, I know you had this issue with Theo, and I felt sorry for the Minister of Justice. He really got a lot of pressure on top of him because of that whole situation. And I think there's only certain things he could do. He has to operate within the law.
So his hands were kind of tied, and of course, everybody wanted him to empathize or maybe sympathize more with the party leader.
Outside the bounds of what he was even authorized or able to do, right? So there was a lot of friction there as well. A lot of friction about the airport. Talks about, bringing in other sources of funding when there were, for me, was a very clear option that made sense.
Right.
I mean,
money was on the table.
Money's on the table. So look, the 100 million for the airport, 50 of it came from European Investment Bank as a loan to government, therefore loaned to the airport. 50 million came from World Bank as a grant to government. And my proposal was lend the money to the airport at low or no interest, and then instead of repaying government, repay that money to SZV, because government owes SZV 50 million. So with that same 50 million, you would solve two problems. So very clear for me, there wasn't another proposal on the table that was even close to this in terms of the benefits for the country.
Sure.
Right? So why would you take a larger loan for more interest, except that you don't want supervision, because once you take World Bank money, you get supervision with it.
Of course.
Right? And then you can't play your games.
Was the chaos and confusion in the games coming from within the coalition, or was it from the outside the coalition and muddying the waters?
It was coming from within the coalition.
Okay.
And look, I've seen different governments. I was there in the government when William Marlin was Prime Minister. But William Marlin was the clear leader of the party. He clearly had the votes behind him to back him up. So when he spoke in Council of Ministers, you knew that it was also basically speaking on behalf of the coalition, at least to a strong point.
Sure.
But within the last government, Leona Marlin, and again, I think she certainly tried her best, but she didn't have the votes. She didn't have the mandate to be there and speak with that authority. So within the government, always kind of felt like, oh, we need to go back and check with coalition. Well, you can't run a country always having to run back and check and see, is this okay or not? You have to stand up for what's right.
It felt like the coalition was on shaky ground for many, many months. Yes. And it's sad to say, but the break in government almost felt inevitable, even though it was very unwelcome. Something you and I were speaking about off camera was the possibility of having an election for members of parliament and also an election for the ministers, which is something I think makes a lot of sense. But how practical is it to I guess, adjust our constitution to allow for that?
So look, this is almost New Year's. I think it's a good time for people to have some hope and optimism and understand that there are solutions to our problems.
Yes.
The solutions are fairly clear. The execution of them is a lot more complicated.
Yes.
Okay. So if you understand that, I think part of our problem is this manipulation or control. So coalition appoints the ministers, you sit down, you decide on a governing program, and if you don't do what they want, they threaten to pull you out, right? This is a fundamental problem. You're supposed to have a separation. Right. So I think that and imagine, you're going to have an election, you're going to have 15 members of parliament elected, they're going to choose a government that actually you have, as the public, you have no idea who they're going to be. No. They could be amazing, or they could be jokers.
And in most cases, it's people who contested the election, or oftentimes we've seen people that contested it and performed poorly to the voters, at least. Right. Yeah.
So if you had what I suggested, what we talked about, is a separate election for parliament, and then a separate election, and I would say that have a prime minister and have them lay out who the cabinet members would be, then the public would have a very good understanding of, okay, I like the candidates you've chosen for the different portfolios, and we will support based on that.
So you would have a team of 7 essentially campaigning.
Exactly.
With a clear leader and a skill set for each other, of the other party, people on that party or on that list.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
And then you have really a true separation between Parliament. And Parliament would still have its role. Parliament would still have to control the budget of government. They'd have to approve that. All legislation would still obviously go through Parliament. And I think you could even say that Parliament would have a right, I mean, just off the top of my head, say with a 2/3 majority, if they really are not in favor of government, that they could dismiss government, which would mean
another
election.
Ministerial election.
Which would mean another ministerial election. Right. And the other thing is, you could even stagger the elections, right? So if you have the ministers there for 4-year term, and then a gap of 2 years, and then the parliamentary election, then actually you also have this sort of constant
So it's a
dynamic.
constructive way of having elections every 2 years, right? So
better than every
we
year.
Still have some continuity, right?
Exactly.
Now, is this a vision of your party, or is this just your personal idea?
Well, I think it certainly started, and I've been really thinking about different ways how we can fix this. I mean, I'm a solution-oriented guy. I'm a problem solver. So I look at what's the root cause and what can we do to solve it. And I think that in my discussions with the party, I see that in our manifesto that's coming out, they've adopted this concept. So I think that it's indeed gaining traction. Here's the hard part. You're going to go to a parliament who is used to using the current system to manipulate,
Their interests, yeah.
to ask them to change the system to give up that power of manipulation.
Sure.
So I hope that the parliament would be mature enough to see that.
Would you need just a majority of parliament to accomplish this, or does it have to be like
I
unanimous?
think you need a 2/3 majority.
2/3 majority to
Right.
amend, essentially,
But
I
if
guess it's
there's
amending the
another
Constitution.
solution, fine. But,
Sure.
and I'm working on other possible variations, but it's very hard because you have this free mandate for members of parliament. So it's very hard to prohibit people from leaving with their seat.
Correct.
Right? So
Correct.
I think this really addresses the problem. And if the ministers or the people who campaign for the executive branch, if they're not ethical or if they do unethical things, they won't be able to come back again.
Right.
Whereas in Parliament, they can come in no matter what. I mean, look, we have a number of parliamentarians under investigation, and they keep running anyways.
Right.
And then they just put their
What about
their
screening candidates before they actually postulate themselves? Especially if they were to do a ministerial election.
were going to do that, you'd almost have to look at some sort of a
They have to be
pre-screening,
pre-screened, right, yeah.
which is also good for the population. Then you know that the people who are running are people who have integrity.
Of course.
Right? So I think I realize that for the VDSM, for government, it would be a lot more work to have to pre-screen all of these people. But
it's serving a greater purpose, right? What about this actual screening process? Is that too stringent, or has it become too stringent, or do you agree with the way in which it's done?
Through the screening process, unfortunately, many times.
Yes.
And I've passed, obviously, with flying colors. So it means that I think you could look very clearly and say this is a person with integrity and honesty. Otherwise, you wouldn't have passed the screening.
But there was a time when I think I heard a rumor saying Emil was not going to pass because there was somebody who was or had an accusation against you. So there was nothing that was actually stuck on your record, but there was a pending investigation which may or may not have had any substance. But the point I'm getting at is somebody who postulates himself could fail the screening because of a bogus investigation against them. Right, because of a slanderous comment. Exactly. And that's what I'm getting. Is that too? Yeah, of course.
You see it around election times. People start making accusations because they're kind of posturing for who can and who won't get in. And that's kind of sick, if you ask me.
Right.
But in any case, pass the screening with no problems, right?
Right.
So, but indeed, I think that the screening process is a difficult process. But you're in a high-level position.
Sure.
You have a lot of influence. You have a lot of budget under your discretion. So I think it is appropriate that you have ministers with integrity.
Yeah, of course. I think the Parliament as well should be the case.
In government, there was discussions about whether the cabinet members should be screened.
Fair.
And actually, the decision from government was not to require them to be screened, but personally, I believe they should be because, again, you see a lot of cronies end up in cabinets.
Right.
And they have access to all of the information, actually, that the ministers have. They see everything that the ministers
they
have.
have more influence, right?
Well, they see everything.
They see everything, right.
So from a confidentiality perspective, they should be able to pass some level of a screening, I believe.
Sure.
I believe.
Now, you've served as a member of Parliament and also as a minister.
In Parliament, very briefly.
Very limited. Okay, but you got a little taste of it.
Yeah, very little.
Do you have a strong preference as to serving in Parliament versus serving as a minister?
That's a good question. Remember, I come from private sector. I was 13 years president of SHDA, president of the Caribbean Hotel Association, ran my own businesses, so I understand the private sector very well. Mm-hmm. Got into government with the intention of really making a change, so came in on a mission. And actually, it was very good for me to go into the executive branch as a minister to understand the really how government functions. Sure. And so to bring some of that private sector experience into how government operates, and I think that there's a lot of possibilities within government. So I think that now, with the experience from private sector, the experience as a minister, I would now like to bring that to Parliament, because I see that as long as you're changing governments on a every year to 2 year basis, you can't, as a country, move forward. So for me, that stability in government is critical, and I think having a government in there that's a good caliber, is critical. St. Martin's a beautiful place. St. Martin has so much potential. And actually, you hear it from private sector all the time. St. Martin does well because of private sector in spite of government.
In spite of government.
They feel that, yes. And so government should be a facilitator. Compliance with the law should be the path of least resistance, right? Instead, we make complying with the law cumbersome and complicated and time-consuming. It shouldn't be.
About the tax code right there.
Tax codes.
Where do you stand on tax reform?
Look, maybe this won't be popular,
okay,
but I think eventually you're going to have to look at some sort, let's not call it an import duty, but something has to be collected on things that people are importing directly.
Sure.
Look, our local businesses, right off the bat, they have a 5% difference in incentives in terms of, they're already going to be 5% more expensive than any foreign company, than an Amazon, for example, right? So the difference in price, I don't think 5% is going to make a big difference. If your incentive is to buy abroad, look what it would do to government revenues, though. Of
course.
And it would at least help to level the playing field for our local businesses.
And online shopping is something that's going to continue to become more and more popular. It's not going away.
It's not going away. It's going to become more and more prevalent. You talk to the wholesalers, you talk to the merchants in town, and they say, they go to the shipping companies to pick up their goods, and they see stacks and stacks of boxes from the online suppliers, right? So if you want to level the playing field, fact is, government needs more money. So if you want to generate more money to pay for the social programs, we all want to talk about better schools, better infrastructure. You want to talk about all these things, but there's no money to do it. You're going to have to look at something like that.
As you mentioned, the business community has played such a key role in the redevelopment of St. Martin, and the reason we keep moving forward, right? But I think a big challenge businesses have with complying or the low compliance rate on taxes is related to being so complicated. Is there any, I'm sure I know there was talks from the Minister of Finance, I almost called him your minister, sorry. But there was talks from the previous Minister of Finance on tax reform, on a new tax code, but unfortunately we never got to see that unveiled. Is there any insight you have to that, and is that still a priority for the UD moving forward?
Compliance in general, for me, is a big problem in St. Martin. This is something I've spoken about many times. I like to go out with the labor inspectors. I like to see what their working environment is and what they're finding. And I can tell you there is gross non-compliance. And I know that a lot of the businesses, they have undocumented workers, and I don't blame the undocumented. A lot of times they're being taken advantage of. They don't know the laws, and they're being worked. They're not being paid appropriately. They're not getting their overtime hours, things like that, right? So I'm just saying that we need to clean up this poor compliance. You're going to see it on taxes. So what I'm saying is make a decision with the people. Either deport them or register them and let them pay their taxes and their social premiums. But make a decision. Right? You get these people who are in between for years. You meet people who've been on the island for 20 years. Undocumented. And then they show up in our social system, and then you say, oh, well, they were here for more than X period of time, so they have a sort of acquired rights. So make up your mind. You're not fair to anybody. And each of these positions is an opportunity for employment with one of our local people. So do we really have an unemployment problem, or do we have a lack of compliance problem? And I think we have a big lack of compliance problem, right? And I mean, I've been out with labor inspectors, and I've seen projects that are under development and workers getting paid cash. I'm telling you that there's tax revenues out there
that's being missed.
Being missed, and they're, in my opinion, they're low-hanging fruit. So for me, there's a lot of money that's on the street that if government was just a bit more private sector thinking, a bit more private sector oriented in their thinking, there's a lot of money out there.
Any intention to lower the tax burden on those who are compliant?
I think that's a fair point, right? So the tax burden is probably artificially high because the compliance is low. So as you improve compliance, I think you could look at reducing that. There's some discussion about the building of affordable homes, for example, right?
Yes.
I'm skeptical of the proposals. Government doesn't have land. You're talking about taking money from APS and S&V. I don't see that happening.
Sure.
Tap into private sector. You could almost, and again, I'm thinking out of, off the cuff here. You could almost consider something like the French side has done with some sort of like a defiscalization type of mechanism to say, look, if you build housing that fits these criteria, we would give you a tax incentive, or the profits would be tax-free. Come with some incentives for people to build social housing. A lot of people, I see it, you see it, there's a lot of property that's undeveloped, or damaged and not repaired. But if you said, look, we can come with a program to give you an incentive to rebuild it and provide social housing, that we would give you a tax incentives to do it. I think there's all kinds of ways to mobilize the public to do that.
Well, I've seen in some inner cities and around the world where they've done incentives allowing developers more density, but they must provide X amount of units within a certain bracket. And this will allow them an extra 4 or 5 floors or what have you. But yeah, definitely we need to look at creative ways of that. Talk to me about the national health care. This is a program, I'm not sure if it was your initiation, but it's something you've been heavily involved with along with the hospital. How realistic is that going to be rolled out? Who all will be covered and who's going to pay for it?
Great question. So indeed, when I came in, there was already a draft for national health insurance. Indeed found that there were some things that needed to be adjusted within it. And I think that we worked together with the ministry to do that, talked with private sector, and of course, you've seen it in the US with Obamacare, Trump care. This is a topic that really divides countries. It's a very contentious issue. Yes. Here's the reality. In a sense, we already have a form of universal health coverage, meaning, indeed, those that are working are supposed to have health insurance, but even if you're undocumented and you have a life-threatening illness, government will end up paying for you to be evacuated out, right? So you haven't paid into the system. Sure. If you don't have health insurance, the hospital has to, based on humanitarian reasons, they won't turn people away that are seriously ill. So our system doesn't work very well. You have a lot of sole proprietors. I mean, actually, probably in the insurance industry, in the real estate industry, you know this. Absolutely. There's a lot of sole proprietors who don't qualify for S&V. Then they go to buy private insurance. But private insurance, basically after 65, 70, you can't get private insurance anymore. Then it becomes very expensive. So we have a lot of gaps in our system, but those people eventually end up back in our system anyways. Right. So we have a poorly organized sort of universal coverage. So what we're saying is, fix it. Bring it above boards. We believe that everybody should have access to health insurance, because if you don't, that means, in essence, you don't have the money. If you get sick, we're going to let you die. That's what it translates to, right? So the question is, how do you make it affordable? So this idea that it isn't affordable is nonsense. It depends on the level of care that you're going to provide. It depends on, so if you said, okay, universal health insurance means aspirin and Band-Aids for everyone, then of course you can afford it. Right. So it's a matter of determining what level of care you can afford, how much coverage you're going to provide, right? And the other thing is, our system needs to be fundamentally overhauled, because we were talking again about prevention is better than cure, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Absolutely. And so the idea is, how do we keep the population healthy in the first place, right? How do we then find them, if they're ill, diagnose it at an early stage where it's easier to treat and they can maintain their lifestyle, right? That's a big way of bringing our healthcare costs down. And that means empowering the family physicians, they're the frontline doctors, revamping, I would like to revamp the way they're compensated, right? A lot of times right now they're paid based on the sick leave control, which they don't do a great job of doing anyways. I would rather find a way to incentivize them to keep the population healthy. We looked at in the general health insurance, saying, look, here's our premium level, and that we would say, if you went to your doctor on at least an annual basis, we would give you a reduction in your premium. So it means, go to your doctor. If the doctor says you're in good health, you don't need to come back till next year, you get your reduction. If they say, whoa, you need to come every month for some reason, and then that, as long as you adhere to your health regime, they would give you the reduction, right? So things to incentivize keeping the public healthy. Sure. The other thing what we've come with is a proposal for a differentiation in the coverage. So what we're saying is, Based on if you're Dutch or permanent resident, you would get one package. And actually what we're saying is if you're on a temporary residence permit, your insurance would cap at a certain amount, and then the employer would need to buy a supplemental insurance. So it helps us to control costs. So there's so many mechanisms that we can put in place to help to manage the costs.
So as an employer, how is this going to increase my tax burden or stay the same? I certainly won't decrease it, but
we talked about it. One of the things that makes sense is we need to disincentivize people from hiring foreign labor because they're cheap, right? We want you to, if you need skilled labor that's not available, we should facilitate you hiring them.
Yes.
But we want to discourage you from hiring people simply because they're cheaper or willing to work longer hours, etc. Right? This will actually make that pool of workers a little bit more expensive, which means it gives you an incentive to hire locally and perhaps pay more money in order to hire and attract that local base, right? So it serves actually two purposes. So that's one way we can help to manage and control our costs as well.
A lot has been said about the amount of money we're paying for referrals, for people going to Colombia, most popular. You mentioned earlier in the interview that the plans for the hospital are still moving forward. Yes. So with the new hospital, I'm hoping it's going to address this need for outside referrals. And how much can we see that number coming down?
So the hospital has already began a process of expanding the number of specialties that they offer. So if you remember before, if you wanted to see the eye doctor, you had to be referred to the French side. Now you can see them in the hospital on the Dutch side, right? Urology, neurology. So we have a number of specialists that were now available in the medical center. And part of that is due to a cooperation the hospital had with the Bess Islands. So Seba, Stacia, actually they helped and they contributed money, they lent money to the hospital so that they could buy the necessary equipment in order to begin with those specialties. But then they also agreed that when their patients came and made use of those services, that they would actually pay a higher rate in order to repay the loan.
To help repay.
Yes, a win-win solution, right? So we're already seeing those extra specialists and you're seeing the reduction in referrals abroad. But you are also going to see some increases based on the fact that now, because those specialists are available locally, you're detecting things earlier. So you're going to see, what we expect to see is we expect to see a bit of a spike in presentations of illnesses, and then it'll decrease. And what we're actually addressing are illnesses that would have showed up later in a much more expensive stage. And then certainly the new hospital is absolutely about how do we keep the patients here? Because number one, we believe that sending people abroad isn't good for them. It's expensive. Of course. But also we believe that people heal better when they're at home, when their family and friends are close by.
It's a burden on the entire family when someone has to go to Colombia in that state, especially.
Exactly. So remember, the hospital is financed based on a business plan. Part of it included an adjustment in the tariffs, but part of it included that this money that's currently being sent abroad would now be spent locally. And that means it's going to create jobs. So number one, it's jobs for the construction of the hospital, but also in the future, I think it was estimated about 70 full-time good-paying jobs are going to be created for the new hospital. And actually, you're going to see, we're already seeing people from the neighboring islands starting to come and use our services. So in a sense, this is a true medical tourism as well.
What is the timeline on the hospital? Because it feels like we've been talking about this for years. It feels almost like a pie in the sky now.
Right.
But you mentioned, and so how vulnerable is it, let's say, to changes in government or to the elections, the outcome of the election?
The hospital process is in the last stages. The financiers are all on board. It actually should start really within days. So the idea is the first wing of the hospital will be built where the parking lot is in between the current SMMC and Learning Unlimited.
Okay. Yeah, the empty lot.
It'll be built there. I think it's like really right up to the edge.
Coming down the hill, basically, is that empty parts of the land.
Right up to the edge of the hospital.
Okay.
Then the hospital will move into the new general hospital, demolish the old hospital, and then build a second wing of the hospital. So it's a
Okay.
two phases of the construction.
How many floors?
I forget if it's 3 or 4 floors now, because they moved a portion on top of the roof. I don't know if they consider that a floor.
Gotcha. And the total timeline for completion, let's say phase 1?
So I think it's about 3 to 4 years for total. Remember, because
Both phases, right?
yes,
So
exactly.
the first phase probably about 2 years, second phase about 2 years.
Exactly,
plus or minus.
exactly.
So hopefully by the next election, the hospital will just be completed, hopefully, right?
And I think it's also important to point out here. The World Bank has committed $25 million to the project,
Okay.
right? And again, I think this is because we've done a good job of working together with World Bank and with the Dutch.
Sure.
So they put money into reinforcing the current hospital, the roof of the current SMMC,
Okay.
because that hospital has to last another
Of course,
3 years
right.
during the construction period. But they've also put in, I think, 17 million into changing the structure of the new hospital to a poured-in-place concrete structure. So they've really upgraded the structure based on Hurricane Irma, and that's also taken a bit of time to redo the designs for that.
Interesting.
And then they also put in $3 million towards JCI accreditation. So not only working on the hard parts of the hospital, but also the soft parts in terms of quality control mechanisms and staff training. And so, I'm very proud of it. I think the St. Martin's going to see, and also as part of their process, the review process, they reviewed the whole tender process. And they said from the beginning, if we don't agree with the tender process, we will not be associated with a project that is questionable in nature.
Okay. So
They
it passed
reviewed
the
it,
screening,
it
let's
passed
say.
their screening as well.
Okay. So next question, maybe I'm asking it to the wrong person, but I have to ask, if everything is continuing as planned with the hospital, what was the whole fiasco about between yourself and Dr. Marcelina?
For me, it is really difficult to understand, and I would say it has to do with some sort of a jealousy.
Okay.
I looked at his campaign material, and he's still talking about a new hospital. He works in the hospital. He knows the hospital's coming. The hospital
Right.
construction should start any day. He knows this.
He's fully aware.
Fully aware of it. So for me, you're just playing games with the people, for me, it's this crab mentality of people who are successful, pull them down because it makes me look bad that I didn't do it.
Right,
Right?
right.
So don't let them fool you. The hospital project's coming unchanged.
So quick question. Do you see it as a conflict of interest for members of parliament to also be full-time employed? I mean, in this case, I see there's a conflict of interest. And we had a similar incident, going back to 2010, 2011, with a friend of mine, Mr. Jules James, who was at, the GM of Simpson Bay, and there was a whole Simpson Bay saga playing out in Parliament. Yeah. Personally, I see it as, if you're working in Parliament, that should be a full-time post. But do you see it as a conflict of interest? Should members of Parliament be allowed to be fully employed outside?
Indeed. I believe that working in Parliament is a full-time position,
Okay.
and that you should commit your time and energy 100% to your role in Parliament.
Sure.
And more particularly I think to Luke Marcelina, because you're directly related to the hospital.
Right.
Your income is derived from the hospital.
Sure.
There were times when he would pressure me for permits for doctors, and he was very upset about the whole approval process for specialists. And yet, so at the same time, you're sort of threatening to remove me from my position as minister and then asking for things from the ministry. So I felt that indeed there's very much a direct conflict of interest there.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for sharing some of that behind-the-scenes information. Real quick, before.
I'm an honest guy, and I say it as it is.
Sure. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to touch on something that I know you were working on, I think probably your last week before that vote of no confidence came against you, and that's related to the cannabis industry. So you were working, I think, on legislation to introduce medicinal marijuana on the Dutch side of St. Martin. Where's that process now? Is it still moving forward?
So actually, this was a discussion with the inspectorate of the ministry. And actually, according to what I understood at the time, our legislation actually didn't prohibit the use of medicinal marijuana, but simply that there had to be more clarity and processes and procedures in terms of how it would be imported and what actually was being referred to.
Okay.
So since I've left office, I've sort of lost track with where it is, but indeed the policies for how to go ahead with medical marijuana should be either in place or coming in place.
Okay. Now, was that a final framework, or was there still room for improvement or tweaking on that legislation that was put forward?
There's always room for
Okay.
discussions. But remember, this is for the medicinal use of
Yes,
marijuana,
yes, for the
right?
medicinal, of course.
Which is actually, if you look at it historically, is always sort of the first step towards the eventual decriminalization of marijuana. So as the community becomes more sensitized to it, then that seems to be a...
Or they realize that it's not, you know, the sky's not going to fall. So one or something that I didn't necessarily like on the proposal, at least the way I interpreted, I didn't see an opportunity for local cultivation. It seemed like everything was import only. Is that something that would be introduced further down the road, or is it something that you just don't want local cultivation on the island for that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the issues are regarding cultivation. I could imagine it could be an issue because once you cultivate it here, you know, how do you control it? So I could imagine that might be an issue.
Emil, thank you so much for your time. I know my producers tell me we're out of time now, but it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I wish you much success on the campaign trail. And in conclusion, please, if you'd like to send a message directly to your voters out there, the floor is yours.
I'm Emil Lee. I'm the #2 candidate on the UD slate. I think I've shown that I've worked hard, worked with integrity. I think you can see the fruits of that labor. You've seen it from after Hurricane Irma with the skills training program. You've seen it with the reintegration shelter. The legislation's ready to go to Parliament for general health insurance, which is about insurance for everybody. And the new hospital, for all of the discussions, is still going to come. I think you've seen that I can do the work. I'd like now your trust and your support. Send me to Parliament so that I can help reform Parliament and bring stability to government.
Thank you guys for tuning in to Season 2 of Talking Politics with Arun Jagtiani. These are the bonus interviews. We got a couple more coming at you before the election, so stay tuned. My name is Arun Jagtiani, and I'm a proud St. Martin. In a few short weeks, our country is going to be heading to the polls to elect 15 new members to Parliament, and I think the entire voting population can benefit from knowing a little bit more about who these candidates are. Over the next few days, I'm going to interview a few new faces and a few political veterans. So join me, St. Martin, and let's talk politics.